Hi everyone, thanks for listening to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, we looked at what happens when an absolute monarch isn't up for the job he's expected to do. The short answer, someone else will step in and do the job instead. Sometimes, he'll even do it well. We followed two Danish examples of these grey eminences. Both eventually fell from power, outmaneuvered by their enemies at court. But whereas one, Moltke, landed on his feet, spending the rest of his life enjoying his estate and wealth, the other, Struensee, was beheaded and had his corpse ritually mutilated. Today, we return to Sweden, run by another dysfunctional form of government, where hats and caps struggled for power in the name of liberty. But their freedom to fight each other was under threat. King Adolf Fredrik, and especially his Prussian-born wife, Queen Louisa Ulrika, tried to increase the power of the crown wherever possible. Just because she hadn't been successful so far didn't mean she'd given up. Episode 115, The Swedish Sun King. King Adolf Fredrik died without ever achieving his wife's dream of a more powerful king. Even though he probably wouldn't have minded so much, he never really shared the queen's passion for the project. But their son, Gustav, did. That meant that the crown prince was not only a child, but also a political asset, or potential danger, both for the queen and for the government. Growing up, he'd experienced firsthand the tug-of-war between the Riksdag and the crown. As you may remember, first the politicians decided who his teachers and courtiers would be, hoping that if the crown prince would only hang out with people like them, he'd end up sympathizing with their ideas. Another example was Gustav's future bride. As you may remember, the government decided that Gustav should marry Princess Sophia Magdalena, sister to Mad King Christian VII of Denmark. Gustav's parents, the king and queen, had been dead set against the match, hoping instead to get a daughter-in-law who was German, just like they were. But during the Age of Liberty, neither they nor Gustav himself had any say in the matter of who the crown prince would marry. When Gustav relented and married Sophia Magdalena in 1766, this upset his mother immensely. Queen Louisa Ulrika thought he should have insisted on picking another bride. She never made peace with the decision and would make the life of her young Danish daughter-in-law difficult at court, taking every opportunity to demonstrate her dislike for her. Despite the politicians' best effort to educate/brainwash Crown Prince Gustav, his mother, Queen Louisa Ulrika, managed to inculcate in her son the best thing for the country was a strong king at the top, and that his current position was not only bad for Sweden, but humiliating for the crown. The king deserved a lot more power than what the current constitution gave him. Unlike his father, Gustav embraced this thinking wholeheartedly. He was an active participant in the machinations of the court party, and it was to no small part because of his pressure from him that his father, King Adolf Fredrik, went on strike during the so-called December Crisis of 1769, which led to the dissolution of the Riksdag and the fall of the Hat government. Much like his mother, Gustav was cruelly disappointed when the Hats then once again reneged on their promise to increase the king's power after they formed a new government. When Adolf Fredrik died in February 1771, Gustav happened to be in France. Well, I say happened to be, but that's not quite true. He loved France and everything French, the language, the culture, and not least importantly, the political system. Gustav was a great admirer of Louis XIV, and now, when he was King Gustav III, he wanted to become Sweden's Sun King, just like Louis had been. In June that year, Gustav III opened the session of the Riksdag with a speech where he talked about the importance of reconciliation. He stressed that Sweden needed the warring politicians to stop fighting each other and instead focusing on what was best for the realm. He also reiterated his support for the constitution, addressing the members of the estates, saying, "Born and raised among you, I have from the youngest age learn to love my country and to see it as the utmost fortune to be a Swede and the greatest honor to be the first citizens among a free people. Stirring words, no doubt, but Gustav didn't mean any of it. As we've seen, his Prussian mother had taught him that it was an insufferable humiliation for a king to be treated merely as the first among equals. He should have absolute power, just like his uncle Fredrik the Great of Prussia or his brother-in-law, Mad King Christian VII of Denmark. So when his feelers for political reconciliation were rejected, Gustav III wasn't exactly heartbroken. Instead, he decided that it was time to put an end to the destructive squabbling of the hats and the caps. He was going to take the power the politicians had promised to give to his father twice, but never did. He, Gustav III, was going to take charge and save the country from its elected politicians. Just like a king should, at least according to his mother's way of thinking. He couldn't do it single-handedly, though. He needed help. And that help came from aristocratic officers in the army who were worried that the current government was both undermining the privileges of the nobility and reducing the budget for the armed forces. Their plan was to first take control over the important fortresses in Kristianstad in Scania and Sveaborg, a new military installation on the coast just south of Helsinki that served as a lock of Finland, making any future Russian occupation impossible. The brand new fortress, constructed after the War of the Hats, was sometimes called the Gibraltar of the North. Once these two strategically vital positions were under their control, they'd march on the capital to force the estates to hand power back to the crown. It was a military coup, but Gustav III himself called it a revolution. 4 years before the Boston Tea Party and 7 years before the storming of the Bastille. But it almost ended before it had a chance to begin, because the conspirators acted too quickly and put the wheels of the coup in motion before things were ready in Stockholm. But when the news reached the capital that a coup was underway in Kristianstad, and the government gave orders for 9 regiments to march on the capital in defense of the current political order, Gustav III decided he had to act immediately if he didn't want to suffer the same humiliation as his parents had after their failed coup attempt 16 years before. So, on August 19th, 1772, King Gustav III appeared at the arsenal to appeal to soldiers from the Royal Life Guard Regiment. With him, he had a large entourage of aristocratic officers. Gustav and his coup buddies tagged along when the guards marched to the royal palace for the changing of the guards, and there the king addressed the officers of the regiment. He gave them a little pep talk explaining that the politicians were making a mess of everything, but they should have hope. He had come to save the day, and if they would just join his revolution, everything would be great. To begin with, his words were met by stunned silence, and for a few awkward moments, maybe the king started to fear that it would all go sideways. But then one of the officers finally, but enthusiastically, shouted he'd be willing to give his blood for the king. This outburst got the party started. People hollered about their devotion to the king, come what may. When they'd calmed down a bit, all the officers swore a formal oath of loyalty to the king, all except 2 captains. These 2 were arrested, and as soon as they were safely locked up, the king dispatched soldiers to arrest the council of the realm that was meeting in another part of the palace. The rest of the morning, the Life Guard regiment fanned out across the city and took control over its strategic positions. The king tied a white armband around his left arm to symbolize freedom and revolution, and everyone who was on his side pulled out their own handkerchiefs and did the same. After this day, the white armband became an official part of the Swedish officer's uniform and would remain so for years until the end of Gustav's dynasty. Everything was going according to plan when suddenly news reached the king that a regiment from Uppsala had arrived at the northern city gates. It had been called to Stockholm by the government in order to arrest the king, before the king had a chance to arrest the government. But this last hope of the representatives of the Age of Liberty was soon dashed. The soldiers who'd come to arrest the king were met by a delegation from the Royal Life Guards, and soon the newcomers had joined the coup as well. When the evening fell that day, the capital was completely in King Gustav's hands. not a single shot had been fired and no blood had been spilled. The general mood was happy, and in the streets, people and soldiers were milling about singing a rather sycophantic song written by the Swedish national poet Carl Michael Bellman. It was called Gustav's Toast, and extolled him as the greatest king in Scandinavia, considering that the only other king in Scandinavia at the time was the clinically insane Christian VII. That was perhaps not a particularly high bar to pass. And to be perfectly honest, this particular melody may not be Bellman's finest work. 2 days later, the king was ready to take on the estates. The Riksdag was summoned to the Hall of State at the royal palace, where the king gave yet another speech. This time he was far less cordial in his approach, and instead poured his wrath over the politicians who, he claimed, had so catastrophically mismanaged the kingdom, wasting time and resources fighting each other instead of taking care of the country and its people. Gustav declared that from now on things would have to change. He proposed a new constitution and expected the estates to see that it was for the best. To help the estates reach this conclusion, the king had ordered the cannons be placed outside the Hall of State. The windows were opened, and the members of the Riksdag could see soldiers with torches, ready to light the fuses if the estates didn't agree to the king's proposal. They agreed. The Constitution of 1772 put an official end to the Age of Liberty. But it still didn't grant Gustav the same unfettered power that his Prussian grandfather and Danish brother-in-law enjoyed. The new form of government was based on the Enlightenment principle of separation of powers promoted by the French philosopher Montesquieu, whose thoughts perhaps even more famously inspired the American Constitution. From now on, the king would be the executive power, whereas the Riksdag retained its power to pass laws and impose taxes. The king was also required to obtain the consent of the Riksdag if he wanted to start a war. On paper, the Riksdag actually retained a lot of power, but in practice, the king became a lot more influential. Crucially, there were no longer any fixed times for when the Riksdag was to be called. During the Age of Liberty, the Riksdag had gathered every year, but from now on, it would be completely up to the king to decide if the estates needed to come together. And when the Riksdag wasn't in session, the king called the shots alone. That's because of another important change. From now on, the Council of the Realm was appointed by the king and not the Riksdag, and the council was answerable to the king alone. In addition, the role of the council was reduced to advising the king, not making any actual decisions. The king wasn't even required to seek the council's advice except in legal proceedings and the appointment of senior administrators. The only exceptions were questions of peace treaties and the king's travel abroad. In such matters, the monarch had to follow the council's advice, but only if all the members were in agreement. Otherwise, the king could act as he saw fit. All in all, this was an enormous change in the way the country was governed. The Dowager Queen, Louisa Ulrika, was elated, positively giddy with pride at her son, who had finally put an end to the Age of Liberty that she hated so much. She was so excited that she even forgave him for having agreed to marry the Danish princess. She did not, however, stop bullying her daughter-in-law. And it wasn't just his mother who was happy about the developments in Stockholm. Gustav III received congratulations from Maria Theresia in Austria, Louis XV of France, and Charles III of Spain. All these crowned heads of Europe were pleased to see the end of the Scandinavian experiment of liberty, hoping that there would be no more attempts at expanding the power of the people. Gustav III was also pretty happy with himself. He even had a special medal struck to commemorate his revolution and ennobled several of his co-conspirators. So what did Gustav do with all his new powers? Well, he actually started off with a whole bunch of reforms that won him popularity in wide circles. For example, he annulled all convictions for political crimes during the Age of Liberty, and he even released the people who had been arrested for opposing his coup. He abolished torture, ordering all torture chambers to be dismantled. The penal code was also reformed, reducing punishments for various crimes. He improved the system for providing medical care, which, to be perfectly honest, had been rather rudimentary. He also reformed the state bureaucracy, cracking down on corruption and establishing clearer guidelines for civil servants. He deregulated the grain market, thereby reducing food prices. Unlike many of his subjects and predecessors on the throne, Gustav III was tolerant of people with non-Protestant religious beliefs, possibly because he'd spent a lot of time in Catholic France, and possibly because he wasn't particularly religious himself. So he allowed Catholics and even Jews to settle in Sweden without first converting to Protestantism. The small Jewish community in Sweden actually celebrated 250 years in 2025 thanks to the reforms of Gustav III. In 1777, Gustav became the first head of state in the world to recognize the independence of the newly declared United States of America. Already in October 1776, he had the following to say about the American Revolution. "It's such an interesting spectacle to observe a state creating itself, that I, if I weren't who I am, would go to America to closely follow the phases in the establishment of this new republic. This may be the century of America." This outburst of admiration for the upending of royal power, in the form of the British rule over the American colonies, may come as a surprise. But, as I've noted before, Gustav was a great admirer of France and everything French, and since France had assisted the Americans in their war of independence against the British, it made sense that Gustav was on their side too. One of the things he admired so about France was its culture, and he wanted to import some of that to Sweden. Or rather, he wanted to establish a national Swedish culture inspired by France. He established a number of royal institutions that were supposed to foster this Swedish culture, not least by granting stipends and providing job opportunities to scholars, artists, and actors. Among these institutions were the Royal Academy of Music, the Royal Academy of Fine Arts, the Royal Academy of Letters, History and Antiquities, and, perhaps best known today, the Swedish Academy. The 18 members of the Swedish Academy were tasked with cultivating, improving, and defending the Swedish language. But today, it's best known internationally for deciding who is awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature every year. He also founded the Royal Opera and the Royal Ballet Company, and after having established a norm for writing plays in Swedish instead of French, as had been the case before, the Royal Dramatic Theatre was also established. Gustav III had a burning passion for the theatre, and from time to time this interest caused concern at court. He'd get so personally involved in the production of plays or costume design that he sometimes neglected the running of the country. He also loved to act himself, which was considered just as weird at the time as it would be today. Imagine the President of the United States in leotards performing a role in some play by Molière. It would raise eyebrows even in our days of less strict codes for expected behavior and decorum. You may have noticed already that many of the king's reforms were similar to those introduced by Struensee in Copenhagen more or less at the same time. That's not as strange as it may seem. Throughout his youth, Gustav had been taught about the Enlightenment, a way of thinking that was all the rage in fashionable circles at the time. Not only among radicals and progressives like Struensee in Denmark, but also among staunch defenders of the old order, like his mother, Dowager Queen Louisa Ulrika. Among the crowned heads of Europe at the time, the ideal was the so-called enlightened despot, a monarch with absolute power who used that power to improve the lives of his subjects through tolerance and liberty. It may sound like a contradiction in terms, and for good reason. In practice, it tended to end up with more despotism than enlightenment as soon as the subjects took all that talk of tolerance and liberty a little too literally. For instance, Gustav III felt strongly that the press should be free, in theory. But when various papers started to print articles that were critical of the king and his policies, he didn't hesitate to limit the freedom of the press. This opposition against the king started to take form already at the Riksdag that met in 1778, 6 years after Gustav's coup. The opponents criticized both the king's tendency towards absolutism, despite what the new constitution stipulated, and specific policies. The opposition felt that the king was going too far in his reforms. For example, Gustav introduced a bill that would finally and officially abolish capital punishment, except in the case of murder. Already before, Gustav, who by law had to sign every single execution order for it to become valid, had displayed a tendency to avoid signing these orders and thereby effectively sparing people the death penalty. This behavior was seen as scandalous lenience on the king's part, especially in cases of men convicted of sodomy, a crime that carried the death penalty. Some modern historians have pointed to this fact as an indication that Gustav himself may have been a homosexual. To be fair, it's not the only such indication. For starters, it's clear that Gustav and his wife Sophia Magdalena were not happily married. Their marriage had been a political union, like so many other royal marriages who rarely had the luxury of marrying for love. But most royal couples made it work, more or less. Not so Gustav and Sophia Magdalena. They didn't consummate their marriage after the wedding, and it didn't take long for a deep rift to develop between them. Gustav's antipathy for his wife was encouraged by the Dowager Queen, Louisa Ulrika, and soon Sophia Magdalena, whose life at the Swedish court was miserable, lost all interest in intimacy or even spending time in the same room as her husband. Those who insist that the king wasn't gay have claimed that he was enormously innocent and just didn't understand how sex was done, the ins and out of it all, so to speak. It's not the most convincing explanation, but we have no conclusive evidence either way. But Sweden was a hereditary monarchy, and so the country needed an heir to the throne. In his desperation, the king turned to a certain Adolf Fredrik Munk, a man at court known for his many love affairs with various women, among them the queen's chambermaid. Gustav explained to Munk that he and the queen needed a tutor of sorts, and the courtier was hired to instruct the royal couple how to have sex with each other. We don't know the exact nature of this instruction, but whatever Munk did, it worked, and in 1778 the queen finally gave birth to a son, who was named Gustav Adolf. Both the king and queen showered Munk with gifts. He was appointed master of the horse and created first baron and later count. The queen also gave him a miniature portrait of herself and 50,000 thaler. It's impossible to keep people from asking why someone would be given all these favors, and soon enough rumors were spreading. Rumors claiming that Munk had done more than just instructing, and that the new crown prince was in fact his son. Obviously, this was embarrassing enough, but to make matters worse, one of the people who spread this rumor was none other than the Dowager Queen, Louisa Ulrika herself. This wasn't just awkward for the family, it was also a danger to the crown. If wider circles of people were to believe that the crown prince wasn't the king's biological son, that would undermine the monarchy itself. So Gustav III acted decisively against his own mother, basically threatening her with exile if she didn't recant. Their close relationship never really recovered from this affair. But apart from the awkwardness in the family, Gustav III was on top of the world. In the middle of the 1780s, he took another long trip to France, where he purchased St. Bart's, turning it into the Swedish colony we discussed in episode 108. When Gustav returned home, he was in great spirits. He was on his way to becoming the Sun King of Sweden. Surely a glorious future awaited. Next time, we'll follow his illustrious career, wherever it may take him. Before I let you go today, though, I'm going to answer another question from a listener. Actually, two, connected but opposites in a way. Both questions are reactions to the episode on colonialism. The first listener wants to know why I didn't bring up Norway and Finland in the context of Scandinavian colonization, making the argument that Norway was colonized by Denmark and Finland was colonized by Sweden. The second reaction comes from a listener who took offense by me bringing up Greenland in the context of Scandinavian colonization, claiming that the island wasn't colonized by the Danes, but rather that it was an organic part of Scandinavian settlement in Northern Europe. He adds that talk of colonization just undermines the Danish claim to the island and facilitates any US attempts to take over the island. Ultimately, both these questions come down to definitions. Professional historians, like all scholars worth their salt, enjoy a good argument about definitions. But since non-specialists tend to tune out as the experts tumble deeper into this or that rabbit hole, I tend to include the bare minimum of this kind of stuff on the show. But in this case, a few words about definitions may be warranted. And just to be clear, This is my definition. It's not set in stone, or the only possible one, but I'll boldly presume that it's a definition that quite a few people would accept. So, here we go. With my back against the wall, I'd define colonialism as a policy of a country controlling a territory beyond its borders, using that territory for financial gain, and sometimes populating it with settlers from the mother country. This policy is usually justified by a sense of superiority of the people living in the colonized territory, and sometimes with the stated goal of helping those less fortunate people while still maintaining a separation and hierarchy between colonizers and the colonized, where political, military, and financial power remains with the former. From that perspective, you could argue that there has indeed been colonization in Scandinavia, both in Lapland and arguably in Scania after the Swedes took over and made a conscious effort to turn the formerly Danish region into a Swedish province. On the other hand, both Lapland and Scania were then incorporated into Sweden and given the same rights and treatment as the rest of the country, so you couldn't say that they remain colonized, even though especially the Sami continued to experience discrimination for generations. Finland does not fit neatly into this model. The land on both sides of the Gulf of Bothnia had been settled both by Swedes and Finns long before the Swedish state was established, and in recorded history, we mostly see migration of Finns from Finland westward to Sweden, and not the other way around. That is not to say that Finland wasn't governed from Stockholm, or that the people in charge didn't prioritize their own interests over those of Finland, but that can be said about any peripheral part of any kingdom in the past, and arguably still today. It doesn't qualify as colonialism, at least not without watering down the definition beyond usefulness. The same goes for Norway. Norway and Denmark were two separate kingdoms with their own sets of laws and customs, in personal union and ruled by the same king. Since that king resided in Denmark, the stronger and richer of the two kingdoms, it's not strange that the people closer to power benefited more, at the expense of the weaker and more peripheral kingdom in the union. But the relationship between Denmark and Norway wasn't any more colonial than that between England and Scotland. And beyond the ranks of the most ardent Scottish nationalists, I'm not sure you'll find too many people claiming that Scotland is an English colony. The case of Greenland is trickier. When the island was first settled by Scandinavians, lured there by Eric the Red's marketing trick of naming the inhospitable place Greenland, it wasn't a colonization project in the sense that the rulers of a state had decided to take over this new land. It was settled in the organic way Iceland had been settled. But that Scandinavian society didn't survive, and when Christian IV decided to re-establish Danish control over Greenland, you have a project that comes suspiciously close to colonialism, not least since the Inuits had settled the island in the meantime. I am, however, more than willing to concede that the re-establishment of Danish settlement on Greenland isn't exactly the same as the purchase of Danish colonies in India. I'm not sure you're happy with these answers, and I'm afraid my answers, more than anything else, are a good illustration of the fruitlessness of arguing over definitions, because such arguments tend to say more about the people having the argument than about the reality they're trying to define. Nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. If you crave more content related to Scandinavian history, I recommend you look up the show on social media. For instance, you can go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. And if you've abandoned it in favor of Blue Sky, you can find me there as well. I look forward to hearing from you.